Our next panel is going to be on power, policy, and progress, the impact of next-gen computing. The moderator is Margot Paez. She is a PhD candidate at the Georgia Institute of Technology. She is also joined by James Giannantonio, an ESG Managing Consultant from All Four, and Jim McDonald, the Director of Environmental Impact from Miratech. And introduce yourself.
Chester Nye, I'm also standing in for Sharon, who couldn't make it due to an illness.
Gotcha. Well, thank you very much, Chester, for joining us. And I'll pass it to you, Margot.
Thank you so much, CK. All right, thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. I hope you're still awake. It's definitely that siesta hour for all of us. But I think we have a pretty interesting group here, so really excited to get into this. So first, let's go ahead and just have each of our panelists give a very, very quick introduction for each of, and to share with you who they are. So first, let's go down with the line with James. You would like to go ahead?
Thanks, Margot. Privileged to be here today. James Giannantonio. I have an extensive background in energy management, sustainability management, program management, working with digital solutions, SaaS platforms to help very large companies organize their data and report out to disclosures effectively.
Thank you. Chester.
Yes, Chester Nye. I'm the IT director at All Four, manage their technology program. Come from a software development background, data management background, cybersecurity, and most recently, AI training, data sets, and data management. So.
Very cool. Jim, thank you for joining us.
Thanks. My name is Jim McDonald. I'm with a company called Miratech Corporation. I'm the director of environmental impact. What that is I'm tracking the regulations now globally associated with doing on-site generation at places like Bitcoin mining facilities.
Awesome. All right. Well, so data centers are big in the news lately. It's not just Bitcoin mining, it's also AI, and there's a lot of concern around the impacts of data centers on the electrical grid, the energy transition, the power use, where they're going to be sited, how they play a role in all of this is what I'm hoping we'll get into. So first, I'd love to just open this up and hear from each of you on what the big challenges are with next-gen computing, what's going on in terms of the challenges with the electrical grid and the energy transition. So who among us? How about Jim?
I'll open it up. Yeah,
okay.
So year-over-year growth in the data center market for existing capacity is about 26%, and for contracted capacity is about 50%. Some markets are as high as 200%, like Atlanta. And this is accelerating with the need of AI, generational AI and edge computing cases. And so it's putting increased demand on our existing grid infrastructure and the need to have accessibility for cheap power. So,
yeah, I think we're at a pivotal moment here with energy and Bitcoin mining here globally. You're seeing since 2015 with the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Paris Agreement that we all know of. You have 198 countries that want to get to net zero carbon emissions by 2050. And with the growth of AI and data centers here in the United States, you can see that's going to be a challenge. We're going to need innovation and a grid that really can respond to the demand in electricity that we need to compute these data centers. So, I see data management around Bitcoin mining and data centers as being a pivotal piece of the puzzle in order to understand where we're at and how we can respond effectively to the growth in the industry.
So my experience is mostly with traditional data centers. We did our first data center back in 2006 when they called it an internet hotel. And I go to these things every week. I'm at a different data center conference. I was one in Phoenix last week. I'm back here next week for Data Center World, which is an AvCom thing. And no matter what it says on the program about what they were going to talk about in a particular session, an energy discussion breaks out, whether it's liquid cooling or it's AI or chips. It always starts with what it says on the moniker about what the conversation is going to be, and then it breaks into energy. I mean, for years, when you cited a traditional data center, there was 20 factors, with fiber, renewable energy from the utility, resistance to natural disasters, like you wouldn't put it on the coast, earthquakes, things like that. Now it's all about energy. They'll just go anywhere where there's power. And it's such an amazing phenomenon, and it's unique times that we're living in with regard to how the grid can work with these new high demand users.
So that's really interesting, because if you go to a Bitcoin mining conference, it often comes down to energy as well. So I'm wondering if, because you've been in the data center world for quite a long time, Jim, has that always been the case? Have people who have been citing data centers or thinking about data centers, was energy always a big piece of the puzzle, or was it an afterthought?
When energy was cheaper, it was an afterthought. Mm-hmm. And then the zero carbon footprint thing came about probably 10 years ago. Every data center of any considerable size says there's zero carbon footprint. And to the general public, they would think, oh, behind that building, there must be all these solar panels. But behind that building is actually the substation where they're connected to the grid. The zero carbon footprint part comes from buying renewable energy credits from other parts of the country and laying it over the power. So it's become more of a PR concern more than anything else. I mean, I spoke at a data center panel in Loudoun County, Virginia, which is the data center capital of the world, last June, and there was actually people outside picketing. The irony was that they organized on Facebook, but they were there picketing data centers and saying, no more data centers, no more diesels. So it is a bigger concern now than it ever was about water, power, all of the environmental aspects of what they do.
Yeah, I would add that Chester and I at Awful, we work with a lot of data center companies, and the topic of energy and the demand that's going to come their way has grown intensively over the last few years. So especially down in Research Triangle area, as Jim alluded to. Phoenix. Yeah, Phoenix, Arizona. You're having a lot of companies come to us and say, hey, we're not sure if we're going to be able to provide electricity to, if we're going to be able to get electricity from the local utility provider to do the stuff that we want to do over the next few years. And that could keep a lot of data center companies up at night, for sure.
Yeah, so what are the challenges now with siting these data centers? Because it seems like there's a huge demand now for power, especially with generative AI. The projections make it seem like a lot of these utilities have underestimated the amount of demand. I think we heard that out of Georgia recently. So I would love to hear from each of you on what you think are the major challenges right now amongst siting a data center.
Well, we already mentioned the power availability. Energy mix is part of that, and maybe James can speak to that from a Scope 2 perspective. But they're looking at power density requirements for these next-gen AI platforms are between 4 to 7 times greater than existing cloud compute platforms. And a lot of these data centers, who purchase land years ago, or who are trying to pivot to take advantage of and provide co-location services for next-gen AI compute, just didn't really consider the power density issue. And also cooling requirements are moving to immersion or hydro or dielectric oils and that sort of thing, and many of them aren't really engineered. Even the land itself isn't engineered for that, and from a water management perspective. So I think it's it's pretty surprising, the power density requirements, and NVIDIA just announced this year that their power density on their next-gen AI chips are increasing 40% over top of their existing power footprint. So, it could be that, a year from now we're already behind in terms of current planning. So, that's my thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, to go along that whole water topic with data centers, it's really, something that these companies need to look at when they're figuring out where they want to build their data centers. And there's an environmental justice piece to this. If you're going to be using a lot of local water to cool your data centers, especially with the growth of that data center as it heats up more and more, you got to look at the impacts it's going to have on the local community and make sure that you're doing proper resource allocation and being transparent with how much water you're going to use so you can understand how it's going to affect the community in which you operate.
Okay. So there's something that I personally didn't think about when it comes to siting a data center, and one that has to do with these air permits. Now, I didn't think about data centers requiring that because usually it's a building full of computers. Where does the air permit come into this piece? So I think, James, is this in your wheelhouse, or is that Jim? All right, Jim. I would love to hear more. What's the missing piece here?
Yeah, so the air permit primarily is around the backup diesel generators. So every data center is going to have backup power because they can't lose power for milliseconds. If they go down at all, it's hundreds of millions of dollars of a problem. So if you put in a 30 megawatt data center, you're probably going to have 40 megawatts of diesel engines behind the building so that they come on when the power goes out. In reality, what happens is the power goes out. There's batteries that are set up to catch the first 10 seconds. That's called the UPS system. And then the engines are up in 10 seconds. They use diesels because that is the fastest reacting power that's available. You can get a diesel to come on in about 10 seconds. So, but in reality, these diesels, other than they exercise them once a month just to make sure they come on, these diesels operate 50 hours a year, maybe. They're really there just in case of a blackout. So there is an air permit, but it's just why you need it is the sheer volume of these engines. I mean, there's data centers that have hundreds, if there's, I know 2 data centers that have over 1,000 backup diesel generators on site, and it's a big PR issue.
Wow. So, James, you mentioned environmental justice concerns. How do you deal with that with the diesel generators?
Well, I think as Jim alluded to, it's not a huge impact currently, and diesel's not as dirty as it may seem, especially when you're not using it as much. But there is a huge potential opportunity here for data centers to move away from that old technology and start thinking about creating and implementing microgrids right next to their data center using solar PV, wind, battery storage to catch any unused energy that they can maybe put on at night or when emergencies do happen. So there is an avenue here where we can get rid of the diesel generators altogether and move more towards renewable energy.
And is there a future, or maybe in the present now, where data centers are using their backup generators as part of demand response?
Sure. So.
And maybe you could quickly explain for our audience what demand response is.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah.
So, if you think about it, here's a Dominion, the utility in Northern Virginia, who's servicing all these data centers, has a transmission problem right now. If you want to site a new data center in Virginia, it's going to be 2 or 3 years before you get your substation, and it's not a capacity problem as much as it's a transmission problem. The data centers would love to do renewables on site, but right now. In Loudoun County, if it's zoned for a data center, it's about $3 million an acre of land. So that's a pretty expensive PV grid. So forever, the data centers have been approached to do demand response. Demand response being on call with the utility so that if they reach a peak in their operating capacity and they're getting thin on margin, They could call the data centers, and the data centers would pull their load off of the grid. Let's just keep it at that. Sometimes you can export to the grid, but let's just keep it right now. It's classic demand response. They're pulling their load off of the grid. Problem is you will get compensated for that. The problem is the EPA looks at that differently. If you are making money with your backup generators, they're going to insist on them being what they call Tier 4 generators, which are 95% cleaner. So there's expense involved with cleaning up the generators, and also these data centers are making so much money, the revenue that they make from these programs isn't really worth it to them. The value they do see in demand response programs is the forward notice of something at the grid level if there's a problem at the grid level. Let's say unplanned maintenance of some large generating asset at Dominion. The data center wouldn't know anything about it, except if they were enrolled in one of these programs, they would get a call saying, we might ask you to come on 6 hours from now.
One thing I'll probably add there, is a difference between the Bitcoin mining data centers, of course, and traditional data centers in that Bitcoin mining data centers, you can essentially just pull the plug. They don't need quite as much backup generation capacity because they can respond so quickly. So in the 10 seconds that a traditional data center will take to ramp up their diesel generators, a Bitcoin mining data center can respond by reducing power or shutting off mining. But it's interesting because the AI industry is looking very closely, I think, at this distributed computing type of scenario and the power availability and the air permitting challenges, and then looking to do what's called edge computing, where they're moving basically immersion or liquid-cooled containerized AI compute nodes, just like Bitcoin mining containers, and moving them into Tier 2 or Tier 3 markets where there is available power, there's less of an issue with air permits, they're a little bit more location agnostic and distributed, and those applications are going to increase too as companies look to leverage on-site AI generation and that sort of thing. So it could be that in the not too distant future, a certain percentage of the demand for these kind of things would move into an edge case.
So just really quick, you said quite a few terms here that I don't know if all of our, we have a mixed audience of tech people and policymakers, and could you quickly just explain a little bit more about what is edge computing? And you mentioned a couple of different tiers. What does that mean to be Tier 2 or Tier 1?
Yeah, those are, the tiers are primarily just the markets, like, for example, Northern Virginia and Phoenix or Dallas-Fort Worth would be a Tier 1 market. And then Tier 2 markets might be like an Altoona, PA, or in Ohio or something like that. They're not quite as optimally located for fiber and other things. And then Tier 3 would just be kind of like even more, even less ideal, I guess, in terms of the location, but maybe more ideal for the customer if you're a corporation or say you're a medical facility or something like that and you want compute basically on premise. And then to respond to your edge computing thing, so traditionally, when companies are hosting data or they're doing advanced calculations with AI models or they're doing training, they're going to do those in a traditional data center, in a cloud-based data center. But more and more, we're seeing kind of specific applications and companies being concerned about privacy and cybersecurity by putting their data in these cloud-based solutions. They don't want to train their competitors' data sets and things like that, and so they're wanting to move that AI training closer to their facilities or in a more private situation, and so they're deploying these containerized computing things on site.
Okay, so we're talking about this energy transition, right? The grid's changing. We're adding more wind and solar. That's intermittent, and that means it's not always online. It's not a one-to-one replacement with a base load that can come on at any time that you need, something that's traditionally powered by fossil fuels, coal, natural gas. So how do next-gen data centers or next-gen high-performance computing play a role in a grid that is going to require more flexibility on the demand side? Because my understanding is that traditionally data centers are not particularly flexible. So is there an expectation that next-gen computing is going to be more flexible, like in the way that Bitcoin mining is right now?
I think certain computing applications can be more flexible. AI is probably a good one, right? It can be designed in such a way where you spread out your risk geographically in a distributed system, just like Bitcoin. But I think that there are some applications that will still require that always-on situation. I would imagine data centers would probably be incentivized to have a hybrid approach where a certain percentage of their assets they can shut off and a certain percentage of their assets they can remain running. This could be a way for existing data centers, for example, to build out AI compute without necessarily impacting their air permit because they could shut those assets off. So I see a situation where there's a hybrid at most sites in the future.
I also think we're seeing a convergence here with AI and data centers, right? So AI is going to really be able to bolster the predictive analysis of how data centers operate and what time they should do a demand response based on their local utility provider. So you got to keep that in mind as generative AI grows and develops. It's really going to help data centers and other industries figure out the best times to shut down, when to operate, and so forth and so on.
Yeah, one trend we're seeing, and just about everybody in the data center space is talking about it, is generation on site. So if you go back to my story earlier about $3 million an acre, their preference would be to use that all for server rooms. I mean, but in reality, they're going to have to carve off a piece of it to put some sort of self-generation on site. And if you're waiting 2 or 3 years, if you bought 40 acres at $3 million an acre, and Dominion says, we can't give you power to 2027, they really don't have a choice. They're not going to sit there with a cow pasture for 3 years waiting for Dominion. They're going to build a power plant during the construction phase, and then when the transmission line does arrive 2 or 3 years from now, that would now be a peaker. And it goes to what Chester was saying earlier, is if the rack load increases and they only built a 50 megawatt substation, now they have a peaker on site that can grow with their demand. So how is the general public going to respond to that? I mean, if they're picketing because you're putting a bunch of diesels in, they're going to picket if you say you're putting in a small modular nuclear reactor. So how are they going to do it? They basically say, we are going to power the town with the critical services in the town with the excess capacity. So we're going to take natural gas engines, we're going to create a 30 megawatt power plant, only going to use 20 megawatts, and if the power does go out, we're going to power the fire station, the hospital, and the 911 call center. And
there's environmental justice things there as well with providing excess energy to the local community. Something that could be a backup if the local utility provider goes down during power outages or so forth. You can use these microgrids that these data centers are creating to help out the local neighborhood.
A good example of this is Microsoft's investment in Helion. They're a fusion startup, basically, and they are creating basically plasma fusion using helium-3. They make their own fuel from deuterium, which is readily available, and they're targeting commercial reactors about the size of a bus that put out about 30 megawatts. So, and they're building their 6th generation test facility now, and they're projecting a cost of less than 2 cents a kilowatt hour for that power, which includes the cost to enrich the fuel. And so you see private companies who are putting their money where their mouth is, wanting these on-site generation assets, who are thinking in the future and in making those investments because they see this public-private partnership with utility-scale power generation and the absence of that available power in the markets where they want it. So,
do you think with the trajectory and the growth in data centers right now, that do you think there's going to be a competition for power between these next-gen computing systems and electric vehicles or heat pumps or anything else that we're trying to electrify as part of this net zero plan?
Yes. I mean, in short, yes. I mean, I saw some statistics about, hey, if we just try to hit these EV goals, you know, we just don't have even the generation capacity for that, yet alone everything else we're trying to do. So, of course, the price of power is the thing that's going to go up in that scenario. And we're already seeing it. You know, there was a long downtrend in the cost for power for data centers, and it's really, took a hockey stick up over the last few years in high, double digits, 14, 20% in some markets. California as high as 35, 40%. And so I think you're going to see, a lot of creativity around stranded energy sources and trying to eliminate waste and drive efficiency in the existing systems. I think there is a pretty big opportunity with the existing data center industry with immersion cooling to have much more efficient power usage and heat dissipation and get more bang for your buck out of the existing infrastructure. But that's capital investment and retooling of that asset. So, and I think that's happening.
And that becomes extremely important given the SEC's climate rule that they voted on March 6th of this year. These data center companies are going to have to find ways to reduce their carbon footprint because it's going to become mandatory to report out over the next few years, depending on the size of these data center companies. And like I said earlier, with the global Paris Agreement of a goal of getting to net zero carbon emissions by 2050, mitigation strategies and innovation strategies, as Chester noted, are going to become more important.
Okay, so I think that's a really great segue into touching on the policy side of this, right? There's a lot of players in government who have design rules, who are designing rules around and legislation as well around what data centers need to do, certain requirements that need to be met, in particular the EPA, the DOE, and the White House. So what's it like working within the governmental structure and building out these data centers? Are there any particular challenges that data centers are facing that maybe they weren't facing before?
I guess I'll start with that.
Okay,
and I'll
great.
just use one example. NERC, the Electrical Reliability Council, came out with their report in December. And if you look at the map of the United States, just about everything is high risk or elevated risk. It's a little scary. But I've been meeting with the utilities out in Phoenix, where a big data center boom happening in Phoenix right now. And they have a list of about 40 real applicants for data centers waiting to be built there. So these people have submitted their plans asking for a substation. 40 is a ton of data centers. And they've got to prioritize them somehow. They want to do first come, first serve, to be fair, but in reality, they can't do it that way. So what they're doing is they're saying, if you bring capacity, you're going to move up in the queue. So bringing capacity means have generation on site. And what they're asking for is for you to be able to get knocked off the grid for 300 hours a year. So it's a demand response program is essentially what it is. And they can do that with their backup diesels that they've already purchased and have there. The problem is that the EPA says they have to be what they call Tier 4 certified. Now, these data centers say, we want those diesels to be as clean as you can make them, which is essentially Tier 5, another level. But the EPA is saying, no, you can't have it that clean. You need to buy Tier 4 because that's the letter of the law, which doesn't make any sense at all. EPA's rule says, which they came up with 20 years ago, you must be Tier 4 and you need to buy it from Caterpillar, Cummins, MTU. You can't buy it from the marketplace. So it's this quandary where the data centers want to be cleaner than they're being asked to be, and yet the rule is saying no. And then those turns out that quite often those certified gensets are not available from those companies.
So how can we address this particular challenge then? Because obviously we want cleaner data centers, but it seems like there is this particular rule in the way. So what's one way that we can solve this problem?
Sadly, we went. Sorry, there's no one here from the EPA, is there? Sadly, we went to the EPA and asked, okay, we explained these people want to be much cleaner than even the rule says. How do we go about changing the rule? And they basically said you're going to have to enter into a legal process, and it will take several years to do that. In other words, they're saying sue us, and then we'll get a rule change. And there's got to be a better way.
Yeah, I would imagine that a conversation might be a better a better place to start. But I think part of it too is in the data collection. So you touched on this on your panel, and part of what the Department of Energy is looking to do is part of it's singling out an industry, but the data center industry more broadly is very comfortable with data reporting, and of course, James touched on the Scope 2 emission reporting requirements coming up, but many are already voluntarily reporting their mix of energy and the credits that they're purchasing and things like that. So this is not an unusual requirement, but even as you noted, to get more granular about what optionality is in a particular market, you really need quality data. And so I think partly it's a conversation, and partly it's a partnership on the a collection, the privatization or the anonymization of the data, and then presenting that and making policy decisions on good data. Because unfortunately, there's not a lot of great data available, at least in the Bitcoin mining space. There is in the data center side, and of course, Jim alluded to that. There's conferences all the time. It's quite well established what the data is. But I think these next gen data centers, especially with the power density requirements, there's still a conversation to be had there.
Yeah, and that whole data management for Bitcoin mining is going to become more relevant and in play as we move forward here. You know, there's a lot of kickback from the Bitcoin community about sharing your Bitcoin mining data and activity, but it's going to be imperative for the industry to move in that direction in order for collaboration and innovation to really set in. So Margot presented on this earlier. She got data from about 10 Bitcoin mining operations for her study, and it's not an easy process right now where, you know, it should be, and there should be a national, a global standard that kind of consolidates all the Bitcoin mining activities so we can understand its impact on the local grids.
Well, of course, I agree. Send me your data. Okay, so I think, James, you did touch on this a little bit around Scope 2 reporting, and I think that SEC, correct me if I'm wrong, they made some changes around what needs to be reported?
Well, they omitted Scope 3 emissions, which is really emissions that stem from your upstream and downstream value chain. But they did include and kept Scope 1, direct greenhouse gas emissions, and Scope 2, indirect greenhouse gas emissions. And Scope 2 is essentially energy that you're purchasing from another party, like an electricity company. But you know, that rule is in litigation already. It's only about a month and a half old, and we all expected that. But the writing's on the wall. It's going to happen. We're seeing in the EU it's already happened. Other markets such as China, most of Asia, already have government-mandated climate disclosure rules in place. So, you know, if you want to, you know, especially if you're a large accredited filer, you really want to get ahead of this, start organizing your impact, your data, so that you can report out and become transparent and avoid fines, and really become a player in the innovative future of data centers and Bitcoin mining.
Okay. So what kind of generation do we need to come online in the next decade in order to meet all this new demand from data centers?
A lot.
That's a start.
So I think right now there's just under construction this year, there's probably close to 4 gigawatts just in the data center industry, and just under contract. Most of that is already pre-leased, by the way. So they're selling the leased agreements even before they're building the assets. And so if you were to extrapolate that out even a few years, you could see how dozens of gigawatts just domestically would be needed. And that doesn't really factor in the productivity enhancements of these generative AI and large language model on like the average person. I could see lots and lots of businesses benefiting, and demand only increasing. So we ideally that wouldn't go overseas, and we could meet that demand here domestically.
Yeah, so much of it is really a transmission problem rather than a capacity problem. Everyone was talking today about all the power abundance in Texas, yet the data centers that are being built around Dallas can't get enough power, and it's really just a transmission problem. There's actually data centers that are moving operations north to Tulsa because they can get, the latency is not too bad between the two. It's only a 5-hour drive, but they can get the power up there. So,
yeah, updating our grid is very important and needs to be a main priority for this country. It's outdated. We are seeing a lot of the local utility providers struggling to provide power and to data centers specifically, but the forecast of the growth is really scary when you talk to these local utility providers, and it's important to get key partnerships with them now if you're a data center company in order to start working on these problems and figuring out solutions.
Is there any way to incentivize a build out of more transmission without having to change policy? Because it seems like we're a little bit gridlocked at times in that side of things. Is there anything we can do on the market side or other crazy ideas to solve that problem?
On the topic of these edge computing scenarios, and we had a panel earlier that talked about the Dorothy project co-located with a wind farm, and how much curtailed power that was being kind of absorbed by that modular data center. So ideally, you'd have a plan to kind of take a survey of what your computing needs are domestically, and then work with distributed computing companies to locate your computing capacity where there's excess capacity now, and then basically prove out the demand and build your transmission infrastructure from there. But I mean, Texas ERCOT's a great example. They have a huge amount of renewables right now with wind and solar. Riot and other Bitcoin miners there are already operating and soaking up as much of that as they can. You have flared methane mitigation, which we haven't really got into, but there could be quite a bit of potential energy there in a distributed way with landfills and wastewater processing and digesters and things like that, where you could see a more innovative distributed approach. And as long as the systems were engineered to be responsive to a loss in power, you wouldn't necessarily need the backup generation capacity. You could just absorb the renewables. So.
All right, so we're running out of time, so I'll ask each of you one last question. And really, I would like to know what each of you think the next 10 years are going to look like for high performance computing, but particularly on the energy side, but in general, what do you think the landscape looks like over the next 10 years?
Exciting. Like I said earlier, AI and the ability of predictive analysis and learning and improving upon itself is going to be extraordinary. I really think that the grid here in the United States has a lot of potential to become a lot smarter. And I'm hopeful that with the integration of renewable energy, and as renewable energy skyrockets with growth, that we're going to get there.
Yeah, for me, I'd just like to see the continued distribution of compute into those places where we have stranded energy assets. I would also love to see heat from those systems be dissipated efficiently into other industrial processes. I think we've touched on that in this conference. We do a lot of work with pulp and paper industry and chemical and food and beverage clients as well that have a demand for that low-grade heat. So we'd love to see that partnership happening with industry, other industries. And I'd love to see a scenario where you have renewables paired with grid-scale batteries, paired with baseload generation assets, paired with edge compute for AI, paired with Bitcoin mining, and basically you have software that just would efficiently distribute the energy to the market, at the marginal cost, right? And that would be my ideal situation. And rather than the centralization, I see a trend of decentralization. So.
Yeah, I kind of stole my thunder there, but
That's why I went before you.
remind me not to go last. It's like another industrial revolution. I mean, we go to these conferences and you're hanging around the bar and everyone's in a good mood and they don't see an end to it in the next 10 years or so. But to your point, I mean, if you took PJM and everything that they do, all of the air traffic control they've got going on, and incorporate AI to dispatch the most economical, environmentally friendly assets at all times, they always say, no, everything's on the table. And then you say, well, what about the diesels? Well, not the diesels. They're not on the table. But if you were to clean up those diesels, then you can make them very, very clean. And use them as an asset as well and leverage AI, it'd be a good thing.
Well, fantastic. Please, another round of applause for our panelists.
Thank you, Margot.
James, Chester, Jim, thank you